just like we saw in the Balamor about the 18-hour lag of the eastern the eastern people, let us say the people of Japan, who would start Shabbat 18 hours after Yerushalayim. We found a similar thing in the Kuzari by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, which is in Kuzari Mamar Bet Seif Chaf 220, that the king says to the rabbi, doesn't Shabbat start in China, inasmuch it is the beginning, the eastern edge of civilization? So the Chaver, the rabbi, answers the king, yet the beginning of Shabbat is only from Sinai, or from Alush before it, where the manna fell. Shabbat enters only for those who experience sunset from Sinai westward, in degrees until the edge of the west. Then after that, under the earth. And then after that, Shabbat will be called to China, it being the easternmost habitation. Shabbat will be called or applied to China 18 hours after Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is the center of the world habitation, and sunset in Eretz Yisrael is midnight in China, and midday in Eretz Yisrael is sunset in China. We find the similar type of concept in the Balamor is that there is an 18-hour lag. The beginning of Shabbat starts 18 hours at the eastern edge of China after Yerushalayim. Now, what I haven't been emphasizing is the fact that when you actually read the Balamor and the Kuzari, you get the distinct impression that both of those great Rishonim are placing the date line in Yerushalayim, because they talk about this, they say something is that the day is called from Yerushalayim. And another great Rishon who lived in the 15th century, his name was Rav Yitzchak Yisraeli ben Yosef, who wrote a huge book which is called Yesod Ha'olam, on this type of on this inyan, on the Balamor and on astronomy and about the whole mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, in which he picks up both on this let us say discrepancy in the Balamor and the Kuzari, and says that it's absolutely absurd to think that the date line would be in Yerushalayim. What the Yesod Ha'olam says, if you had a person who was living just outside of Yerushalayim to the east, let's say just 1 mile to east of Yerushalayim, you're telling me that whereas in Yerushalayim, Shabbat would be starting, the sun would be going down, and Shabbat would be starting, but for anybody living just east, if you're making Yerushalayim the date line, anybody living just east of Yerushalayim says that feels that it's Thursday night, and that you've got an entire day before you're going to be starting Shabbat. So the Yesod Olam says that seems to be very absurd. He says, what I really think the Balamor and the Kuzari are saying is that that Yerushalayim is the prime meridian, which then dictates what the date line would be. So if you take a look in the Yesod Olam, which is also in Mamar Bet, the second proclamation, the second pronouncement, Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17, and in the book which is printed, it's page Lamed Vav or maybe Lamed Hey. He's very, very verbose, and I took a section and put it into the notes. If you go to the very top of the section that I excerpted, it says, Vahamashal lazeh, the example is, in other words, he's trying to make the point that Yerushalayim is the prime meridian, and why exactly is that? Why should Yerushalayim be chosen as the place of the prime meridian? And obviously, it starts from the fact that he considers Yerushalayim as the center of civilization, because all civilization is settled 90 degrees either east or west of Yerushalayim. But let's take his actual words, V'hamashal lazehu, and the example is, Kishiktagia chama b'yom hashishi lamod nochach emtza hayishuv, that when the sun gets on Friday to stand just opposite the middle of the yishuv, meaning just directly above, here, let's use the sun, let's say my head is Yerushalayim, okay, and my shoulders, one's east and one's west, Az, he shokat bayomahu, biktzei Biktzei Mizrach, at that very time it is setting in the very eastern edge, meaning in China, V'yatchil l'sham Yom HaShabbat likarei b'shmot tchila. And there in China, Shabbat is being called first in the world, Lefi Haskamatenu, based upon our agreement that Shabbat starts 6 hours in China before Yerushalayim. Ushar b'nei hayeshiv kulam heimum dimazadayin b'yomam shel Yom HaShishi. And the rest of habitation from China and westward is still on Friday, v'korim b'shmo, and is calling it Friday. Ume'az ve'elach ad sof yud bet sha'ot me'azman einach hamaz b'shum makom. From that time on, the sun is setting in the entire Yishuv, because when it's directly above Yerushalayim, it's now at the point of sunset in China, and then everywhere else in the Yishuv, you see the sun setting. It's not rising in any place, Meha Yishuv, from the habitation. Remember, the habitation is only the only eastern hemisphere. There was no habitation known in the western hemisphere. El holechat la b'shokat livnei hayishuv. It is setting for the entire people living in civilization. V'yachrei al seder ad shetishka ba'achrona b'ktzei ha'marav. Until later on, when the sun sets in the west. That's when the sun would be directly over the Tabur HaTahom, B'ktzei ha'marav. Then you would see the sunset in the west. Uchvichein hu yom shishi holecho mistalek shmo mipiyem. So during this 12-hour period, from the time that the sun is over Yerushalayim and then starts to set, which means that it's already at the point of setting in China. I'm just saying this over and over again. For the next 12 hours, people are in the world, in the habitation, are stopping to call the day Friday, and they're starting to call the day Shabbat. So from that entire 12-hour period, starting when the sun is over Yerushalayim, is when people in the Yishuv are starting to call the time Shabbat. That's why Yerushalayim is the prime meridian, because when the sun is over Yerushalayim, people from the eastern edge of the Yishuv are starting to call it Shabbat, and that's going to continue for the next 12 hours until every last person in the Yishuv, till the westernmost person, calls it Shabbat. And I'll just finish to the last 4 or 5 lines. V'hashabbat nichnas lahem v'nikra b'fiyem. The Shabbat is entering for them and is called by its name by their mouth. Ad shiachil Shabbat likareh b'fi b'nei katzeh ha'marav ba'achrona. Until all of the people living in the west, in the end, are all calling Shabbat. Klomar lachar yud bet sha'ot mimash yitchil likareh b'fi b'nei katzeh mizrach. By the end, or during the 12 hours, and until the end of the 12 hours from the time that the people in the Far East started calling it Shabbat. And then this happens when the sun sets in the west, which is, it's the middle of, it's right over the middle of the ocean, and the ocean covers the entire western hemisphere from the west to the east. And at that point, nobody in the Yishuv is calling it Friday anymore. Nobody will consider it Friday. And at this point, when the sun is over the Tavur Hayam and the sun sets in the west, everybody in the world at this point is now going to call it Shabbat. Sha'az heim b'nei ktzei mizrach. Sha'az. Okay, so that's really the end of the quote. So, based upon that concept, the Yesoda Olam is declaring Yerushalayim is the prime meridian, because when the sun is over Yerushalayim, people in the east are starting to call it Shabbat. And when the sun, 12 hours later, when the sun is over the Tavur HaTahom, and by the way, Yerushalayim is called Tavur HaAretz, that we understood from before. When it goes from Tavur to Tavur, that's 12 hours, and by the end of that, everybody in the world is calling it Shabbat. So just to reiterate, the reason why the Yesoda Olam says that Yerushalayim takes the cake in terms of being the prime meridian, but that's because is that midday, and when the sun is over Yerushalayim, let's just say Friday, for example, when the sun is over Yerushalayim at midday in Yerushalayim, the sun's light is illuminating the entire civilization from the edge of the east to the edge of the west, from the eastern edge of the east to the western edge of the west. At that moment, it's sunset in the east and it's sunrise in the west. Then, as the sun starts its western descent from midday in Yerushalayim, as the sun makes its descent, more and more people starting at the eastern edge of China are calling the day Shabbat. So as the sun, if you look at my left hand together with my right hand, as the sun goes west and descends, more and more people in the world are calling it Shabbat, such that when the sun is over the west, half of the people in the world are calling it Shabbat. When the sun then proceeds another 6 hours past midday in the west until sunset in the west, when it's over Tavor Hayam, then 100% of the population of the world will call it Shabbat. So there's the direct relationship between the descent westward of the sun and the increase of the population of the world calling it by a new day. And according to the Yesod Olam, that reason, the fact that the sun over Yerushalayim illuminates the entire civilization, and that as it sets from that point, the world increasingly calls it by the name of a new day, that's what sets Yerushalayim as the location of the prime meridian. So for those of us who have a hard time visualizing the 18-hour lag, let's do a quick 18-hour lag so we can figure it out. Okay. Whoop. Let's put our little sun over the west. Shabbat is just starting in Yerushalayim, because here is Yerushalayim, here is the west, and the sun is, so anybody standing over here, and the sun is over here, sees the sun setting. So Shabbat is just starting. 6 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim. See that? 12 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim. 18 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim, and at this very point, people who are over here, just east of the eastern border of China, are watching the sunset, which means Shabbat is starting for them, not the people in China. The people in China, Shabbat started for them 6 hours before it started in Jerusalem. But we're talking about the people who are, let us say, in Japan, who are in the very, very far edge of the west, according to the Baal HaMor and the Kuzari, according to the Chazon Ish. So therefore, when it's 18 hours into Shabbat, Shabbat is just starting for the people in Japan. Get it? One more time. Shabbat is starting in Yerushalayim. 6 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim. 12 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim. 18 hours into Shabbat in Yerushalayim. For the people in Japan, Shabbat is just starting 18 hours after it's already started in Yerushalayim. That is the 18-hour gap that we're talking about.